why I want to talk about the history of the pack test is I do think that all of the context about, the last 6 to 7 decades of assessment, research, and development in wildland, it needs to be understood before we can even talk about kind of what would be a next step, or if we did reassess the pack test, what would that look like? If we want to have that conversation, which is the fun conversation, we need to understand the origin. We need to understand the context, the background, the barriers, the roadblocks, all of the stuff that's gotten us to this point. So let's get into that. We'll jump into the history a little bit. Where I'm pulling a lot of this stuff is from a few different places. One is this article I found this article actually a couple of years ago, but it's from 1997, and it was by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and they were essentially putting together like a big review on kind of the state of fitness assessments throughout all the different agencies. So they were looking at all the different federal agencies, all the different states. They were talking mostly about Oregon, Washington, and California in this paper, but they were kind of like, hey, this new pack test has been proposed as a potential change from the step test, which we'll get into all of that. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if I just didn't read it clearly enough, or if they didn't even talk about it, but I didn't get a full understanding on if, like, at this point in time in the mid-90s, if everybody was doing the step test or if it was just like certain agencies were doing it. Because the message I got from reading this paper was that there wasn't a one full standard across the entire profession like there is now. Well, for the most part, there is now with the pack test and getting your red card. But it seemed like there was kind of like people were doing their own thing more so back then. And this paper was kind of like looking at what everyone was doing and seeing if the pack test was like a good blanket standard for kind of everybody. So that was from 1997. I also found a couple different articles from like the late 90s, early 2000s, which were kind of like summarizing everything that happened in the mid 90s to go from the step test to the pack test. And I'm just kind of like breezing through this, but it's interesting kind of reading through and seeing how this all kind of started in 1994. 1994 is when Brian Sharkey, who was working at the University of Montana and had been working at Montana and studying this stuff since, as far as I know, 1965. 1994 is when they were like, hey, we need to reassess the step test. And that was after, 2 decades of doing the step test. I know you have some notes about the step test. I'll just cover what I have real quick, and then whatever you want to share about it, I'll let you hop in. But from what I found, the research on all of this stuff started in 1965 with Brian Sharkey and trying to quantify the physical demands of fireline tasks. And that went on really consistently throughout the 60s and 70s from what I've kind of found. And just a quick interesting note too, if anyone listened to Dr. Brent Ruby's presentation during the Human Performance Summit that we did last month, he has some of that initial data that Brian Sharkey found. And he pointed out in his presentation, it was super cool. I think it's super cool because I'm a nerd. But he was like, this is showing, calories per hour for hiking, calories per hour for sawing a tree, digging line, using a shovel, because they used shovels a lot more back then. And they had it all typed out on a freaking typewriter. He's like, this is so old. All of their data was presented on typewriters. And basically what they found, or what Brian Sharkey found, was that all of this kind of equates out to an oxygen consumption of 22.5, and which equates to 7.5 calories burned per hour. And you can see all those different tasks that are listed out. They really are all kind of in that 6 to 8 calories per hour range. Some being a little bit less, some being a little bit more. But that's interesting. We'll get to why that 22.5 number is important for the pack test once we get kind of back around to it. But that's kind of where this started. And in 1975, after Brian Sharkey was trying to figure out a way to kind of measure all of those tasks and then find a way to measure that in the form of a fitness assessment, came up with the 5-minute pack test. So 1975, that was a long time ago. What do you have on the step test other than kind of like it was just a 5-minute step test for like all those fire line tasks.
So when we think about, let's paint a picture here, 5-minute step test, you get a bunch of firefighters going into a lab, going into a classroom, outside the station, whatever. You have them step up onto a little platform, step back down. You have them do it at a certain cadence. You time it. You take the heart rate at the very end of the test, and then you track how the heart rate comes down over the next few minutes. So that's what the step test looks like. Now, why are we doing that? What indicators are we getting from that test? What's the practicality? What's the meaning behind it? The big draw to the step test is aerobic and or cardiorespiratory fitness. So if you strain somebody with some kind of exercise, some kind of push, you get their heart rate to go up and you see how it comes down. Greater endurance trained folks, greater cardiorespiratory fitness folks are going to go up to that demand, but it's going to be way less strain. So if you place that load on somebody and equate it across the board, they're all doing the same task. A really fit person, they're not even going to get close to their max heart rate. They shouldn't even be anywhere near that during the step test. But if you get somebody who's low fit, when they get up to that end of the step test, their heart rate's going to be proportionally much higher because they have a way less efficient cardiovascular system. They're having to pump out way more blood through a way higher heart rate to accommodate that demand. And then when they come back down, it's going to happen slower. So those are the two main things you get from the step test is how high do we push that ceiling for you at a standardized work rate? And then how well can you come back down and get back to normal? So when you think about wildland firefighting, that heart rate recovery piece, super important because your heart rate's going to get spiked over and over and over throughout the shift. And that typically is going to happen every single time you hike in. But what happens when you get to the job site? So those are like two things that you can kind of point to with why this test was serving a purpose for the time being, because you're getting that general insight to general aerobic fitness. But there's a big limitation there in the fact that it's easy as fuck. There's absolutely zero push to this. It's not mimicking the demands of the job at all. So you kind of are having to extrapolate this. Your fitness is what's showing on this step test, and we're trying to relate that to Z. Like it's going from A to Z. There's way too much going on in between. So there's a bunch of pros to the step test and the fact that it's easy to execute, minimally invasive, very low risk, and just very time efficient.
Yeah, it's only
But at
5 minutes.
yeah, so you can scale that. That's a real big bang for your buck in terms of like Forest Service. What can we do to get a general insight to aerobic fitness? Sure, let's throw this out, get some ideas, but what might have happened a ton is that you throw a pack on somebody and have them go cut line and you see that their 45 VO2 max that you estimated that you got from the step test doesn't translate to the task itself. So that's the foundation of where this switch really came from. Because the PAC test is a job-specific work capacity test. The step test is just a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. You can get an idea for how well your body's ability to send blood out to its various systems and get that metabolic demand going. How more robust are you, generally speaking? But the field of wildland firefighting is so freaking niche that there's no way that a general test is going to be able to provide the insight for if you can do the metabolic demands, the cardiovascular demands during the job. So that's kind of the pros cons. And that's the whole conversation we're going to be repeating and just hitting the nail on the head with there's no perfect test. There's zero assessment that is all of the things being met. It's pushes and pulls in each realm. But what the job specific work capacity test is it started to incorporate certain aspects of the job like hiking, like load carriage, like just the locomotive tasks that are a little bit more parallel to what we do, even though me and Austin just kind of blew that one out of the water saying it's awkward as shit and we hated it. So of course there's always those factors at play, but it started to spark the conversation with the fact that just assessing cardiovascular fitness is not simply enough for this population. You have to ingrain the mechanics, the mechanical strain imposed on people, the muscular fatigue, the muscular endurance. Those things also are just as a predictor of whether you can do the job as your general fitness, which is why you might have an elite cyclist that can hammer out that step test and barely go up 10 beats in their heart rate, but you go throw them in the scope of wildland firefighting and it's not going to look the same. So that's what I'll have to say about step test to where we're at in the introduction of the pack.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple good points we need to kind of go further on. One is just that discrepancy between more general just fitness, general aerobic capacity, and fitness that is a little bit more specific to the job. Why that's so important is because, well, especially if your fitness test or your physical assessment has any sort of punitive action behind it. So if this is determining your ability to be eligible for work, and if you fail, there's consequences and you can lose your job or not get hired, you have to be able to prove through very high level like validation sources that this test is an accurate measure of my ability to do this job. And there's so many countless examples across the military, across law enforcement, across fire departments of, lawsuits, people getting sued because they were able to prove in court that yeah, I failed my run, but that doesn't mean I can still or I can't do the job. That happens so much. And so there has to be a really high level of validity behind these assessments. And I've got pulled it up here. This is part of that 1997 paper. And it's kind of saying that same thing. Just kind of, well, I'll just summarize it, but they're basically like the rationale for a full replacement instead of a supplementary test to go alongside the step test is I just lost it. Where is it? The fact that no one can any longer defend the step test in court since it is not specifically task related to the job of fire suppression. So that was kind of the first thing that people were like, hey, we can sue you, or like you're opening up liability to being sued, to having some lawsuits, and to this kind of whole pass fail punitive assessment just going away or not meaning anything, because we can definitively show that it accurately measures fire line tasks. That's the first point. The second point, which is not as fancy or scientific, but it's just the fact that firefighters were like, this 5-minute step test it doesn't match the fire line. We can feel the discrepancy, and this thing it's just not doing what it's intended to do. And that was criticism that was brought up back in the mid 90s, early 90s